there must have also similarities between the theology of Romans and Christians, right?
Oh, profoundly. Profoundly.
Like,
as I say, it was targeted, it's mostly a Jewish thing, what would look at least to Jews in the Eastern Mediterranean as a fulfillment of their own Hebrew prophecies. Remember, this is designed for people who want to worship the Jewish God and who identify, in effect, as people who want to be children of the house of Israel, as Christians do today. As all Christians do today, right? We're all children of Abraham in that sense. And Moses and the development of the Jewish people was the important prologue to the advent of Jesus and the salvation of all mankind, right? Mm-hmm. But notice how it breaks out to the salvation of all mankind with Christianity, instead of just his people.
You always say that the Christians were persecuted by the Roman, and it has been exaggerated in history, you know?
Well, some of it has just been mythologized and made up. Most of the stories of early Christian martyrs are pure mythology. Professor Candida Moss, a very important academic working in the field of history and this specific area of history, has shown that through literary evidence, which is really our basic evidence of most Christian martyrs in the late Roman period, is really colored and recreated at best, sometimes lifted from pagan sources, sometimes created from whole cloth. So most of the legends of Christian martyrs and saints that come from this period are mythology. When you look at the actual evidence of Roman persecution of New Testament Christians, there's actually precious little. The first law ever passed against Christianity was only briefly enforced and only came about in the year 250 AD under Decius, and it's only because he was feeling the heat of the rising popularity of Christianity and he favored other cults. The persecution somewhat later under Diocletian, he was an opponent of Constantine who actively supported Christianity. So it became part of a political battle, and Christianity became a powerful political motivation itself. Before that time, we see very little persecution of Christianity. In fact, Tertullian at the end of the first century reports to us there were large numbers, in effect, of Christians in the Roman army, no less. And that Christians were got off the charges, got off the hook from governors who were trying to let peaceful Christians off the hook. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Christianity advocates paying your taxes, peace, turning the other cheek, rebellion is a sin, obey the state. At one point in the Gospels, Jesus praises a Roman centurion, mind you, as having more faith than any Jew, period. Which is a startling thing in an age of rebellion between Jews and Romans, right? Which sort of leaves the fingerprints of official Rome kind of on it. It was one of the many ways you see those fingerprints. But the earliest mention we have by a Roman emperor or Roman officials of Christianity dates back to the early 2nd century. A correspondence between the Emperor Trajan and his newly appointed governor of Bithynia, which is in modern-day Turkey. And the governor of Bithynia asks his emperor, what do we do about these Christians? And Trajan specifically says, do not hunt them out. Do not persecute them. That's our first reference by pagan secular writers, non-Jewish or Christian writers, to Christianity at all, is a Roman emperor saying, don't persecute them, Pliny.
Right.
Now, there is a tradition that goes back even earlier. Tacitus, the 2nd century Roman historian, tells us in the time of Nero, that following the famous Great Fire of Rome in 64, Nero pinned the blame on Christians. Well, in my view, that makes absolutely no sense. In the year 64, in the city of Rome, there would not have been enough Christians. Let's say the crucifixion happened around 29 AD. Could there have been enough Christians 3 decades later, just when Peter and Paul are arriving to Rome in their first, earliest missions, to have plausibly been a scapegoat for the great fire that destroyed most of the city of Rome? No. And not only that, they advocated peace. And why would Nero persecute peace lovers anyway? None of that makes sense to me, and to a lot of historians. In fact, it's now becoming, I think, sort of the consensus that Nero could not have set the fire himself, and that there's something screwy about the way Tacitus is having Nero blame what we call Christians. We do know that there were Jewish militants, as I pointed out, right? These Jewish militants could be seen as Christians in one sense, Messianic Jews. They believed in a Messiah, and it was that belief in a Messiah which specifically motivated their rebellious activity. The rebellious activity long preceded the war. Around the year 50 AD, the Emperor Claudius had to expel all the Jews from the city of Rome because of messianic disturbances led by one Chrestus. So there was messianic violence in Rome 14 years before the Great Fire. We know there was Jewish insurrectionaries said arson caused fires in the city of Antioch in Syria. We know that under the reign of Caligula, there were disturbances between Greeks and Jews in the city of Alexandria in Egypt. This was an empire-wide problem. It wasn't just in Judea. Right. And the Romans needed an ideological response to it. So in any event, the Jewish war would break out in 66, just 2 years after the Great Fire. It seems to me that the plausible suspects or scapegoats for the Great Fire of 64 are the militant Jewish rebels, not the advocates of peace that we hear about in the New Testament. After all, the Gospels had not even been written yet in 64. Remember, the temple's not destroyed until 70, and the Gospels are written after that. So the Gospels hadn't even been written. So our kind of Christian probably doesn't even exist except in very small numbers. And the plausible scapegoats for the fire in 64, if not the actual perpetrators of that fire, are Jewish militants, the same ones who'd break out into open rebellion only 2 years later in Judea.
Wow.
Now, of course, there were Jewish militants who were crucified by the hundreds, if not the thousands, in the first 2 centuries. Forests of crosses went up for Messianic Jews. And it is that actual persecution that I think forms the basis for the Christian tradition of intense persecution.
Right.
But you know, the fish symbol was no secret symbol at all. Those symbols were openly used and displayed on Christian grave sites from the early 2nd century forward. Openly displayed. The catacombs were not hiding places. Christians did not have to practice in secret. There was no systematic persecution of Christians during most of the Roman era.
Okay, that's a big statement too, right? Because many people think the opposite, right?
Right, but I'd urge people to check out both my work and the work of Professor Candida Moss. The Myth of Persecution is her book, and it'll provide a lot of good basis for showing that nearly all of the Christian legends of martyrs and saint martyrs are just that, legend, literary legend.
So we were talking also about evidence, and I would like you to provide me or to tell the archaeological evidence you found. You mentioned some of them and its significance, right? Like the cross wasn't always the main symbol for Christianity, right?
Right, absolutely correct. In fact, until the time of Constantine, either an anchor or a fish wrapped around an anchor were the principal symbolic representations of Jesus in the catacombs, on Christian grave sites and other Christian sites, much more frequently than the cross. We only have a few instances of the cross as a symbol for Jesus in the first 3 centuries of Christianity's history. We have dozens and dozens and dozens of representations of anchors and fish representing Jesus, anchors with fish wrapped around them representing Jesus throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And it was really only after Constantine, the emperor, had a vision, of the Chi-Rho cross in the sky before the battle, that he and his mother Helena, Saint Helena, converted the basic symbol, although anchors and crosses were continued to be used in Christian churches for some time thereafter. Still, the cross at that point supplanted the anchor and fish, or just the fish, as a symbol for Jesus. What's curious about that is that these same Roman emperors who claimed to be the Jewish Messiah, these Flavians who actually fulfilled Jesus' prophecy of destroying the temple, and who were the second coming, if Jesus' timing is correct, the second coming could only be these Flavians. So if the timing of Jesus' prophecy is actually pointing to the Flavians in a backwards prophetic justification of their claim, which is what I and scholar Joseph Atwill have argued, then what we're looking at, obviously, is something altogether different than what people normally think of in this department. It is this emperor Titus, the son of Vespasian, uniquely almost among all emperors, with a couple of minor exceptions which are themselves interesting. Only for a brief time his brother Domitian used it, and later during the Second Jewish War, for a brief time the emperor Hadrian used it, perhaps trying to adopt it himself. But apart from that, the emperor Titus was the only one to ever use this symbol to represent himself and his own divinity. So here's a Jewish Messiah, a God-man, a Prince of Peace, a benevolent altruist by his own propaganda, humbly born, and in many ways paralleling Jesus, who used precisely the same symbol as Jesus, that the Christians used for Jesus in the very earliest catacombs early in the 2nd century. This means that the coins still jingling in Christians' pockets had a picture of Titus, who claimed to be the Jewish Messiah, on one side, and a picture of the anchor and fish on the other, still jingling in their pockets as they're using the anchor and fish to symbolize Jesus in the earliest catacombs.
Wow.
Now, there's a lot more. There's a lot more. We went over how some of the propaganda, the ideas that you find in the New Testament are like compassion, mercy, love, peace, concord, harmony, joy, eternity, equity, as well as compassion and forgiveness, were regularly featured on Roman coins of the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. That are ideas that are simply echoed in the New Testament. And as I was doing a monograph on that, the ideology parallels between Roman coinage and propaganda and Christianity, my co-author discovered that the Titus symbol is exactly the same symbol as was used in the first catacombs. So our work sort of converged, and we realized, wow, putting it together, we've got a powerful argument.
Yeah, what interesting discoveries must be, right? Like to be alone must be really hard, but to have someone there that complements you and find different things, and it's like a detective also.
What fun. Collaboration. When it's done with I am definitely an objectivist. Committees are not the source of new ideas. A single mind usually, it always is. And however, when you have two active, creative, independent minds that can get along, collaboration can be a productive and wonderful thing, and a very fun and exciting thing. And we just complemented each other so well. My own forensic and historical background, his excellent background in science and writing, and we just soon he was doing the history and I was doing the poetry, and it all just sort of it got to the point where we look at a single page and, can you tell which is me and which is you? It's like, oh, it's just it's sort of a collective brain there. This is because we went over every single word so carefully and back and forth together. We really can't dissect which is which, except in cases like this, the coinage here and the symbol there, in a few instances like that. But exciting work, yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
Another word on the archaeology, the oldest Christian archaeology that there is, the oldest catacombs in Rome, which are, in fact, the oldest Christian archaeology that we can identify, are not only identified with anchor and fish symbols, but the place itself, the earliest catacomb, was originally built as the tomb of an imperial Flavian, the granddaughter of Vespasian and the niece of Titus, the emperors who claimed to be the Jewish Messiah. According to the 4th century Christian historian Eusebius, this Saint Domitilla was a Christian, and her husband Clement, who was a cousin of Vespasian and nephew, was one of the first century pope, one of the various, and there were obviously no popes back then, but church tradition claims that this Flavian cousin, Titus Flavius Clemens, was in fact Saint Clement of Rome, a 1st century pope, and that his wife, back when popes could be married, was the granddaughter of Vespasian and the niece of Titus, the emperors who claimed to be the Messiah. And that her tomb is actually the oldest Christian archaeology we possess. It is identified by means of the anchor and fish symbols.
you have to have a really good team to find the right sources, because there are so many new things you brought up that hasn't been brought up before, right? So,
Since we sort of had it's a funny story. I sort of had the light bulb go off in my head as I'm reading Josephus, this first century Jewish historian, and when he's making the claim about Vespasian being the Messiah, and messianic claims were the motivation behind the whole war. Then suddenly what the New Testament stood for, peace and paying your taxes, bing! I had the idea, this is Roman propaganda. This is all a proof demonstration of the Flavian claims to being Messiah. They are the glorious second coming. And when I had that idea, I ran over to my co-author's house, because we've been friends since we were children, really. But he was the one guy I knew who would listen to my madness on this. So I pounded on his window late at night, wake up, wake up, wake up. And he comes to the window, and he's all groggy and unshaven and in his underwear. Okay, this better be good, Jim. So I just start telling him, and then his eyes widen and widen and widen and widen. He says, we have to do this. This has to be a lifetime project of ours. And he...
Wow, so you decided that such, like, you know...
We were in our 20s. We were still in our early 20s. And this was before the work of Eisenman, who said, Professor Robert Eisenman has said things similar, before the work of Joseph Atwill, who since said similar things. We'd had the same insight. So sort of a convergence, like natural selection being discovered simultaneously by Wallace and Darwin, or calculus being discovered by Leibniz and Newton at basically the same time. We feel like this is the moment in history for this to be discovered. We now have the tools and the evidence we need to come to this understanding of Christian origins.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's it's pretty motivating too, right? Because there are not so many people that have that vision so crystal clear.
Well, I'll tell you, it took so much effort, and it took so much brain power, and so much, sweat, blood, sweat, and tears, that when I finally got it out in a satisfactory form with my co-author, we had one of the most incredible moments of happiness, really. And it sounds like a bizarre exaggeration if I say it, but I'm going to say it to your podcast audience. I can die a happy man, and I could go on living. I really said what I needed to say and got it off my chest in the way I wanted to.
Yeah, that's amazing. That must be like big joy.
Yes.
Achievement.
So Ayn Rand said to Leonard Peikoff as they were passing a bookstore after Atlas Shrugged came out, and she saw Atlas Shrugged, and I'm not comparing this to Atlas Shrugged, believe me. This is very small an achievement compared to Atlas Shrugged in terms of monumental historical accomplishments. But I somehow in a little way relate to her when she says to Leonard Peikoff, it's all worth it.
Absolutely.
So no matter what criticism I get for this, and believe me, there'll be a lot of Christians and others who are going to criticize me for this.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter. I don't care if it takes 100 years for people to, but I'm pretty confident this will be the consensus view in time.
And that's amazing. And so I was also thinking about there have been so many misunderstandings and confusions in the interpretation, right, of Christianity, history of Christianity. What do you think why so many misunderstandings and confusion and wrong interpretation?
Well, I think Christianity has, much better than certain other religions, has proven itself able to change and adapt over the centuries and the millennia. If you think about Jesus' original doctrine, for example, it radically changed the original Mosaic law of the Jews, which had a doctrine of self-defense and a doctrine of an eye for an eye. And Jesus came along and said, no. You've heard it say, if thou shalt not kill, but I tell you, if you have anger in your heart, you've already sinned. So if you're hit on one side, turn the other cheek. Submit to the evildoer. Do good to those who curse you. So Jesus is advocating total submission. When someone hits you, Ricardo, you can't run away even. You can't block the punch, much less punch back. That would be totally wrong, okay? You have to give me your cheek. Hit me. Come on, hit me again. I submit. So for a long time, Christians believed that ordinary self-defense was a sin. St. Augustine, writing around the year 400, for example, said that killing, even in reasonable self-defense, was self-love, was a sin. So if some crazy man is coming at you with a knife, you can't, knife him back or use the knife against him, even in reasonable self-defense. St. Augustine, nope, a good Christian submits and dies. Because of this strict view of turning the other cheek, popes and the church had to develop a doctrine of just war. Is it okay even for Christians to engage in war? Well, if we're converting heathens, like Charlemagne converting the heathen Saxons right around the year 800, well, that's okay. We can bring Christianity to the Germans at the point of a knife, or we can do crusades against Islam at the point of a knife. But the war had to be blessed by the church and had to be justified. And even then, the penance for the murders of all those people who died in wars still had to be done in some form. A very odd doctrine. It wasn't until the 13th century with Thomas Aquinas and the reintroduction of observational logic and Aristotle and classical knowledge where Thomas Aquinas changed Catholic doctrine on this. And he said, no, look at animals, look at other societies. It's perfectly natural for people to defend themselves. So this turn the other cheek doctrine really only applies, said St. Thomas Aquinas, to clergymen and clergywomen, nuns and priests and monks. And even to this day, nuns, priests, and monks have to submit to violence.
Yeah.
But ordinary Christians, lay Christians, can act in self-defense. And that has been the general rule for both Catholics, Protestants, and even the Orthodox since about the time of Thomas Aquinas, when his more naturalistic, realistic doctrine based on observation of this world and Aristotelian logic sort of took hold. And so it's the ability of Christianity, I would say, to morph and to change as time went on. And by the time you get to humanism, and by the time you get to the Renaissance, Christianity has now opened up to non-Christian ideas in a radical way that Islam never really did. It opened itself up to ancient Greek learning, and they started reading Aristotle and Archimedes and other ancients, and they began to get a focus on this world and life here on earth. And it was that transformation. And so by the time you get to around 1700, you've got political philosophers like John Locke who call themselves good Christians, who are coming out against slavery and talking about the natural rights of individuals, which is a radical change in Christianity and has almost turns the doctrine in the New Testament on its head. Right. And by the time you get to the Founding Fathers 100 years after Locke, or 70 years after Locke or so, obviously whatever conservatives in America say, the Founding Fathers violated every basic tenet you find in the New Testament. America is the opposite of what you find in the New Testament. They say it's based on the Bible. Total nonsense. Total BS. Yeah. There's no nice way of putting that. The Founding Fathers, even the ones who claim to be Christians, opposed taxes. They didn't run under Caesar. They rebelled in violation of Romans 13. They didn't regard King George as the appointed agent on earth. And King George was a pussycat compared to Caligula and Nero, right?
Yeah.
There was no taxation with representation back in the first century when Jesus said, render unto Caesar and pay your taxes. No, and so what you have is a violent rebellion, no one turning the other cheek, no one submitting to the bad guy. The Founding Fathers were the opposite of New Testament Christians. America was founded, in a sense, on the very opposite ideas you find articulated by Jesus and Paul in the Bible. What I think we've done is exposed what was thought of as moral idealism as really just Roman propaganda. If Christians want to go on, continue acting in the path of Roman slaves, they're certainly free to do so, but they should have no illusions that that is precisely what they're doing. Their submission was simply what Ayn Rand said, a form of altruism to get a massive populace to engage in self-sacrifice for political purposes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the work you think you're gonna do in the future, work related to objectivism and its relation with your book, right? That would be your future project.
Yes, I think there's a lot more to say about the nature of religion, about the nature of Christianity, how Christianity's ethics still governs even the most secular leftists, like Karl Marx and his progeny. I think there's a lot more to say in that regard. I think there's a lot more to say in regard to a contrast between Christianity and objectivism. I find a very interesting thing, Ricardo. when talking to people who are growing skeptical of their Christian religion, that's a very fertile audience. They remain philosophical, they remain interested and concerned about ethics, and yet they've grown skeptical of their traditional religious, upbringing or the beliefs that they had previously accepted for some reason. Those people are prime candidates, it seems to me, for a lesson in real ethics and the importance of ethics, i.e. objectivism. And I found that to be the case in my discussions with my book in totally non-objectivist contexts.
All right. It was a great having you on the show. Thank you very much, James.
Well, thank you. It was wonderful.